Why do people detract Darkside Phil? I think watching Phil essentially becomes a game. A weird, exceptional game, but a type of game. So what makes games interesting? One of the reasons people enjoy video games is the element of learning. By playing the game, you are activating the part of your brain that does the learning. So people that enjoy video games also overlap with the people that enjoy learning. I hope the irony is not lost on anyone. Phil hates learning, and by extension he hates video games. His favorite genres are walking simulators and fighting games. Under this framework, I think it should be obvious why Phil enjoys walking simulators. There's essentially nothing to learn in a walking simulator. There's no mechanics to learn other than the QuickTime events and picking choices. Fighting games might be a bit harder to understand under this framework, but I think it should be remembered that Phil's favorite time to play fighting games is in the first couple of weeks as he's climbing up the MMR ladder, playing against people who are bad at fighting games or just purchase the game. I don't think it's a coincidence that Phil rage quits new fighting games after 2 weeks when his MMR stabilizes and other people learn the meta. At that point, Phil has to spend time learning how to play the game, and that's when he quits, because the techniques he learned 30 years ago for a different game are no longer fundamentals. This framework also explains why he enjoys playing Street Fighter II Super Turbo. He doesn't have to learn the game anymore, at least in his opinion, because he mastered it 30 years ago, and he doesn't have to go through the unfun task of learning. Perhaps the reason he hates learning is because he's a narcissist, and it would bruise his ego too much to admit that he was wrong or that he wasn't the best. A question for a more psychological style person. That might seem like a bit of a detour, but I think it's helpful to understanding if you see the framework applied to Phil before applying the negation to detractors. It's been said before, but Phil is both the weirdest streamer online as well as one of the worst. The game for detractors is trying to predict the weird, stupid things Phil does while making his content, or trying to predict how he's going to ruin it. Essentially trying to predict what causes Phil to be such a weird motherfucker. Just step back and look at the absurdity of trying to predict how many face touches Phil does during the daily dump. I challenge you to think of any other content creator that you could play a game like that with. If I asked you to guess how many times PewDiePie, Almighty Tevin, were going to touch his hair or rub his eyes or scratch his nose in the next video, you'd look at me like I was a crazy person. How could you even come up with a reasonable number to a question like that for a normal streamer? But Phil is such a weird person that he can touch his face 20 times in 10 minutes when he knows the camera is on and is looking at his face. The game for detractors is trying to figure out which factors will lead to Phil acting like a weirdo. Detractor 1 could say that Phil is going to touch his face a lot today because he didn't hit the money goals and there's a WWE Champions event going on, causing Phil to be nervous and touch his face. Detractor 2 could say that Phil isn't going to touch his face today because he had his weekly shower before his day off where he spends the whole day away from his wife. I challenge you to find any other content creator on the internet where there's enough information to predict how many times he's going to touch his face in a 10-minute video. Which leads to another point. Phil puts out more information about his life than anyone else who is normal. Why do we know that Phil doesn't take a shower every day? Why do we know that his wife works 2 days a week? Why do we know that he paid $1,500 for a tow job and a dead car battery? And that doesn't even account for the stuff from over a decade ago that people have forgotten about or never watched. The That Being Said podcast joked that you could create an evergreen content channel covering all the weird content Phil does that he's put out over the last 15 years, and you would never run out because by the time you got to the end, there's so much nonsense that your brain forgot half of it. Anyways, I think that's what draws detractors to Phil. He's an enigma with so much information, so he seems like a solvable scenario, because there's a lot of data points to draw inferences and conclusions from. But 90% of Phil's information about himself is just lies or noise. I guess that means that detractors are having their intuitions manipulated. They subconsciously want to learn what makes this weirdo tick, and they think there's enough information out there to reach a satisfactory conclusion. Unfortunately, almost everything Phil says is clouded in a haze of bullshit, lies, and ego. So what looks like, subconsciously, a lot of information is in fact worthless. But Phil puts out so much nonsense that sometimes the truth leaks through, and detractors feel like they understand just a little bit more. That's the game, figuring out what makes Phil so fucking weird.